also some ones that are new on the block. The lady here, the last time I saw her was about 16 years ago in England. So it shows you how popular I am. She came all the way from Scotland.
I thought you came to see me.
Yeah. Well, as Lou mentioned, my interest is in spiritualism, so I'm going to try something different today and talk about spiritualism. It's not too often we hear things in our churches these days. I'd like to start off by issuing a bit of a challenge. We came in here earlier when the Lyceum service was on. I hope we didn't cause any disruption when we came in, but one thing that stood out, I've been involved with spiritualism for over 80 years. I started off in the Lyceum movement. My home church was the East Hamilton Spiritual Church in Hamilton, Ontario in Canada, which my great-grandmother started in 1918. And there was always a Lyceum in that church. And when I was attending it back in the 40s, early 50s, there were perhaps anywhere between 75 and 150 people showed up for Lyceum every Sunday morning. And most of them were children in families. The Stacys, the Paceys, the Burtons, mother, father. In those days, large families were the norm. 3, 4, 5 kids, all attending Lyceum. I walked in here this morning, I didn't see a single child. Not one. My challenge to you is fix that, because if you don't, 50 years from now you won't be sitting in this building. Spiritualism will be a thing of the past. It's becoming a venue of adults. Nothing wrong with that. But the fact of the matter is, eventually we're going to run out of new ideas. We're going to run out of adults. We're going to run out of curiosity. So what are you going to do about it? I challenge everyone, including our institutions, because if you don't fix that, we're on a very, very slippery slope, as we have been over many, many years. We started this venture, let's go back to 1756, where a gentleman, some of us know the name, Emanuel Swedenborg, visited the spiritual universe in his elder years. He was 56 at the time. And he described what he saw there, who he talked to there, and the lessons he had learned. And he came back, wrote a book about it, about all those experiences. He wrote one particular book that was very easy to understand. It's called Heaven and Hell, about his experiences. And he also wrote a 12-volume set called Arcana Celestia, which I defy you to understand. He described the spirit world. He described certain laws that applied to it. And he taught us that essentially what he discovered, that we're all, in some sense, a spiritual being in a parallel universe to this spiritual universe, this physical universe and a spiritual universe. And that certain things were compatible within each. There was a divine influx that filtered down from that different realm into the physical universe. And there was also a corresponding element between the two. There were similarities, called it the doctrine of correspondences, and the divine doctrine of divine inflection. Other than that, he had a problem, though, because he was a Christian. And he was undergoing this extreme experience, this unusual experience. And he couldn't quite separate himself from his Christian values. And he thought he was pretty important, too. He thought, boy, I've done something special here. I know all about it. You know, you're going to have to believe what I tell you. My way or the highway. It wasn't a good interpretation, but it was a beginning. Just a beginning. Because he didn't go away. Because 100 years later, not quite, but starting back in about 1826, a little later than that, 1828, when a young man appeared upon the scene. He was born in 1826, but he didn't become cognitive until he was a couple of years old. His name is on this building. Andrew Jackson Davis. Born in Upper New York State in Hudson Valley. In a place not too far from what we now know as the West Point Academy. A young lad was born, extreme poverty, had no opportunities for education. But funnily enough, he heard voices in his head. And one of those voices was, strangely enough, a fellow by the name of Emanuel Swedenborg. There's a connection there. And Emanuel Swedenborg was teamed up with another fellow, a Greek physician. And they went and played with this boy. They played with his mind. They were with him. They didn't tell him what to do, but they put suggestions in his head. When he ran into difficulties with his friends, they said, don't worry about him. Listen to some good advice. Don't listen to some bad advice. You're in control here. So do what you think is right, not what other people think is right. And they lived with him up until he was an adult. Claudius Calenus, who was the Greek physician, eventually took him into a healing mode. And he became what we'd call a trance healer, so to speak, a trance healing medium. But he had a special faculty because he could see the body in a transparent condition and see illnesses there and diagnose the illness and prescribe remedies. Don't try that as a healing medium today. But he prescribed remedies, and they worked. And a doctor latched on to him. He said, hey, this is pretty good. So this doctor from New York State latched on to him and convinced the boy they should go into business together. And away they went. Here's a young lad, 12, 13, 14 years old, in the business with the doctor, and the doctor's making hay off this young man because his remedies worked. They were obviously, as we know now, coming from some expertise that had knowledge of medical conditions in the spirit-filled universe that were working with them. So they worked, just as they do today. That lasted a couple of years, and Emanuel and Claudius said, no, we're going to have to try something a little different here. So they said to this young lad, we want you to try an experiment for us. We want you to sit in a trance condition for the next while, and we're going to take you on a journey. We're going to take you on a journey to a very special place. Now, a little bit of a background here. How does this young lad get into a trance condition? Well, in those days, there were mesmerists traveling all over the countryside. Franz Anton Mesmer, who used to mesmerize people by essentially, simplistically massaging the aura. Well, he did it with magnets. Called it animal magnetism. Eventually, mesmerism. And people barnstormed all over North America trying this on people. They tried it on me as a kid. Didn't work for some reason or other. But it worked with young Davis. And he went into this trance condition. And Emmanuel took him on a journey to this spiritual universe. And over a period, and this was from, November of 1845 through to March of 1847. He sat 157 different times in New York City. Trans lectures, they called them at the time, each lasting 3 to 4 hours. They were open to the public. They pasted notices on telephone poles and storefronts. And for 157 different nights over that period of 15 months, he visited the spiritual universe. And while he was visiting, he was describing it. So there were people in these sessions writing down what he was saying. There were also people assigned to be there. And then it was open to the public. There was several hundred people who walked in off the street. Nobody ever attested to the fact that this was fraudulent or it didn't appear genuine. And he described what he saw. He went back to the beginning of the universe and in scientific terms described how the universe was formed. In scientific terms. And he described how solar systems evolved in the universe, in our solar system particularly. And he described how the Earth was formed in our solar system. Believe me, in scientific terms. It's documented. And this young lad was illiterate. He could hardly put 3 words together intelligently. And here he was coming up with this scientific language describing how everything evolved. How our Earth evolved, how our planet, how it was formed through gas, electricity, and water. And eventually, the physical form of the Earth appeared with landmass and water. And he described geologically how it was formed in scientific terms. And I won't bore you in all details, but he went through how vegetation appeared, how animals appeared in scientific terms, how human life evolved. And then he went one step further because they took him to that special place. And he defined, essentially, that the human form was slightly different than the other form because it had the ability to reason. And there was a material side to it, a physical side, and a mental side, a different type of science, not physical science, but a science of the mind. And the mind was capable of doing wonderful things and going to different places and talking to different people. Our first introduction to the spirit world. And I always thought this is pretty neat. Here's this young man on his own, visiting the spiritual universe in a trance condition and saying all these wonderful words in scientific terms. And I said, how could that possibly be? Over the course of my investigations of spirits, I've come to one conclusion. Sort of a bit of a challenge. It wasn't spirit talking to Andrew Jackson Davis. It wasn't his perceptions. There's only one logical conclusion, that it was Emmanuel Swedenborg. Updating his level of knowledge after being in that spiritual universe, because he visited in the physical plane and the mental plane 100 years before that, but he was now dead and actually there. So an updated version, so to speak. Now, what did that evolve into? Well, it laid the groundwork for us being here today. It established the philosophy of spiritualism because it described the spiritual universe and the laws governing it. It introduced us to natural law, the things that control the physical universe and control the spiritual universe are exactly the same, all governed by a simple set of laws. The law of eternal motion, which affects the law of eternal progression through the law of cause and effect, all simple. The law of attraction and the law of reproduction, What's more logical than that? It applies to everything. But in a spiritual sense, in the spiritual universe, there's some governing laws. The law of eternal justice, which I'll get around to a little more in a few minutes. The law of universal truth. And my favorite, because I think this is the most important one, the law of universal goodness. Goodness, something so very simple, and so very, very profound. In that journey, he predicted something. He said, I'm going through all these machinations, I'm visiting the spiritual universe. We know that communication is possible, not yet demonstrated. But he said, at some point in time, in the not too long, distant future, this will change. Because there will be a living demonstration on earth to establish that fact. Well, lo and behold, a year later, on March 31st of 1848, he was sitting in his lounge in New York City, and he heard this voice come to him and say, "Brother, behold, the good work has begun. A living demonstration this night is born." That exact same night, 300 miles away, in the small hamlet of Hydesville, New York, one Charles B. Rosna created a great disturbance and aroused the curiosity of a family by the name of Fox. Now, Charles B. Rosna was a peddler who had been murdered in the Fox cottage 5 years previously. So how did he appear? Well, we know. For months previous to that, even a year previous to that, there was all sorts of ramblings going on in that house. Knockings, furniture being moved, strange noises, forcing a lot of people to move out. Some people moved in and said, "Ooh, I'm getting out of here." And then the Fox family moved in. 3 young girls, Margareta, Catherine, and Leah. And you know what young ladies are like. They're full of curiosity. All the young people are. They heard these noises. The parents had heard them. They decided, we can't afford to move. We're staying. But one night, that night on March 31st, the girls got curious. Now, there was only 2 of them there at the time. Leah was off in Rochester somewhere. But Margareta and Catherine decided to have some fun with these noises because they heard these knocks. And they said, it's got to be coming from somebody, somewhere. So they tested it. They said, if you're a spirit, give us a knock. If you're a living spirit, give us a knock. The code had been established. 1 for yes, 2 for no. And eventually they found, through a neighbor coming in, one fellow by the name of Billsler, to be specific, this established, an intelligent level at which they can communicate with these knocks. They found out who it was. Charles B. Rosna. A peddler had been murdered in that house 5 years previously. He had $500 on him. The owner said, "I need that $500. Bang. How do we know? Well, they found the skeleton several years later in the basement, stuck between 2 walls, a false wall and the real foundation. Took us to a different level. We now know that Andrew Jackson Davis was correct, that you can speak with these people through a different form of science of the mind, thoughts. And we still know today that it works. Sometimes it works pretty good. Other times mediums get in the way. The purpose is communication, not advice, not consent. The purpose is communication. A conversation between two people. That's the science of spiritualism. The mechanics of mediumship, with a very specific purpose to prove that there's a different spiritual universe or a different universe with people living there. Not people as we know them, not physical forms, but mental forms. And the best information we have is they recognize each other by the level of their knowledge and wisdom through light, the darkness or the lightness of their light, or the brightness of their light, to the best of our knowledge. We don't know everything about the spirit world. Probably won't even know all about it when we get there. It's a big mysterious trip. People say they know all about it. I'm suspect. Very suspect. I'm always wary of spiritualists that say I'm the way. All we can do is relay the level of knowledge that we have to you. I'm no expert in spiritualism. All I can do is share with you what I've learned over the years. You can accept it or reject it. Doesn't make any difference to me. Just as it was with Andrew Jackson Davis, because he was different than Emmanuel Swedenborg. He didn't say it was my way or the highway. He said, this is what I saw. I didn't talk to anybody. This is what I witnessed and relayed to you. But it's personal. It's my version of things. You can either accept it or reject it. And that's the key to spiritualism. You can either accept it or reject it through your own level of knowledge and understanding of things. Just don't try to convince anybody else of it unless you're asked. We should never impose our views on other people unless they ask the question and then get out of the way. Because if you're man enough or lady, woman enough to ask the question, be prepared to hear the answer. Because I'm a cynical spiritualist. I've been involved with it too long to take it as a matter of fact. So we have two components. We have the philosophy. We have the science. Well, how in the world did we get to become a religion? Because it wasn't in the early days. It was a movement for social activism. That was Charles Rosner's message. I want justice. So call a spiritualist if you wanted to rail against something that was worthy of railing against. They railed against slavery. They championed women's rights, child labor rights. Spiritualism was a movement of social activism. It had nothing to do with religion. It was individualistic. People said it was my way, not your way, and they refused to join anything. No churches in the early days. Churches didn't start appearing until late in the 18th century, or the 19th century, after an event that happened in New York City. Because up to this one night, spiritualists couldn't agree on anything. They weren't even spiritualists. They were just people that believed in communicating with other people in a different realm. But one night, January 26, 1871, in the snowy night in New York City, the third sister of the Foxes, Leah, who was married, moved to New York City at the time, Leah Underhill, held a seance, as we call it, or a circle. And in that circle, the lead medium was a woman by the name of Emma Hardage Britton. We all know that name, or most of us do anyway. A British woman who had moved to the U.S. to gain fame on Broadway. She was a singer and a dancer. Didn't work out, but she met a spiritualist and she became a very good medium. And she was the lead medium at this circle that night. And there were several people there, invited. one of which was a fellow by the name of Robert Dale Owen, who had visited the U.S. previously with his father to investigate spiritualism, this new thing. His father went home. I want anything to do with that. But interestingly, the son stayed there, became very famous, an American diplomat. And his father came through to that circle, Robert Owen, and gave to those that might be interested a few select words. They're called the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, the immortality of the soul and its personal characteristics, the proven fact of communion between departed spirits and mortals, and personal responsibility with compensation and retribution hereafter for all the good or evil deeds done on earth, and a path of eternal progress open to every human soul who wills to tread it by the path of eternal good. Ladies and gentlemen, the original principles of spiritualism. Spiritualism grabbed onto them. They had a common purpose. They started organizing, and churches started to appear. Hence the religion of spiritualism, all tied into what we know of philosophy, science, and a religion. I've come to a different perspective, though. I used to think this philosophy, science, and religion was what it was all about. But I think it's just a starting point. I'm going to finish with presenting you with something different. Why not consider spiritualism as an idea? An idea that a spirit, an individual spirit, is born into this earth plane in the womb of a woman in a state of innocent ignorance, and then changes as it grows older. Comes out of that womb and starts learning things. Most times the first word a kid hears is no. But beyond that, it starts changing. They become different, exposed to different levels of love, different family atmospheres, different environmental conditions, different educational opportunities, different political views. They start to change, develop their own personality. The idea that this could happen, that a spirit could be born and grow and learn and be in control of its own destiny, not through guidance from spirit, but through their own level of knowledge. The idea that this could happen, the idea that that spirit survives beyond the physical and moves on to different opportunities. It's just same as Christianity. Who cares whether Jesus lived or not? Look at the idea behind that. So I would ask you to look at the idea behind this thing we call spiritualism. Because what it does is gives each of us a measure of control. We control the whole thing. Let's be tolerant of one another. Because if you buy into this concept, this idea that everybody's just different, that's all you have to worry about. We're just different. None of us better or worse than the other person. We're just different. What an opportunity for tolerance. My message to you is, that's your choice. How you want to evolve into that level of difference. Are you happy with your life, or your circle of friends, or your circumstances now? And if you're not, you have an opportunity to change it. Because what we have learned from that other dimension, through those that have come back over the years, the last 170 some odd years, is that we're in control. They're not. We're in control. We determine our pathway. And I think if we can realize that, that takes us to a level that we're all looking for. Something that we're all looking for. It joins every single person on the face of this earth together. One word. Doesn't matter whether you're rich, poor, Osama bin Laden, or any other despot or leader you ever think of. Everybody in the face of this earth is looking for a level of happiness. One thing. How we get there, that's up to you. You're in control. But leave me with one last word, and I'll get out of your way and let you get on with your life. There's one pathway to happiness. In my mind, it's called usefulness. How useful are you to yourself and to your fellow human beings? Thank you.
Thank you.